How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm going to start just real basic. What made you interested in joining Kids Now?
Yeah. First and foremost, the script really. I mean, I don't think I'd ever read anything like it before. I didn't know anything about. I mean, 1970s Australia. Never mind this very peculiar thing such as tent boxing. I think I had a vague awareness of its existence, but had no frame of reference.
Yeah.
And so that really primarily the more I read the script, because I'll read a script numerous times,
Mm.
even before I decide to do something, and it just every time there was something new, some piece of subtext or some kind of like hidden depth to a character, and I thought the characters were remarkable, like just so very much alive, and they just came off the page to me. I could sort of picture so much of it already. Um, so there was that, and then really my conversations with Paul Goldman, the director, um, has a brain the size of a planet. Super interesting way into filmmaking. Coming from music videos, working with Nick Cave, and I've always liked Nick Cave's music and had lots of questions for him about that time. And he was sort of forthcoming with it, but often not, a bit guarded. So, so yeah, so that was, it was really interesting talking to him, and then I went away and actually, shamefully, I guess at the time, hadn't seen any of Paul's films, so I went away and watched some of his work as well, and um, I was like, whoa, they kind of just on the cusp of experimental and like very kind of wild. There was a kind of wild element to them, and that really speaks to me, especially in films that I love. There's a wildness to them, I suppose. And I thought, yeah, this looks like a good recipe. When do we cook it? And so that was it, really.
And had you ever picked up boxing gloves before this or no?
I had I'd done a little bit of boxing with my personal trainer. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but we had done some boxing together. And it was funny the timing of it because he had just recently died, and I was like looking for a way to become much more active
Mhm.
again. And this was a really good excuse, I suppose, for that. And so yeah, so I trained for 6 months with a guy called Rob Lynch in London. And then after that was over, I went over to Perth, and it was interesting because the sort of language of the sport of boxing itself can get lost in translation from club to club. Like there are different approaches, and it was interesting because I wasn't totally unpicking everything I'd learned. I had a good grounding in it.
Yeah.
But we were sort of then finessing, I suppose, and tweaking and looking at like the anachronisms in some of the stuff that I'd learned because we're looking at a very specific period of time in boxing and type of the sport because it's in a tent. Um, so there's more showboating and it's more entertainment based than anything else. So yeah, don't know if that was your question, but yeah,
No,
that's
that did. Yeah, it's very interesting too that you brought up the anachronisms because as someone who knows very little about boxing, I wouldn't notice, but it's nice to know that that thought was there all the way through. Your character Kid, he's very quiet, and I feel like there's a physicality to your performance, obviously because of the boxing, but then because you don't have all of like it's not a very wordy movie in terms of your role. So did you
mm.
feel like you had to rely on your body language in a different way than you have in previous roles because of this?
Yeah, it was a real gift to me. I think often less verbose roles are it's a bit daunting in some ways as an actor because you are much more exposed and you have to really have thought about what is happening in the scene. Not that I'm not saying I don't do that normally, but you can't rely on the verbal expression of what is happening because that kind of tells you how the character is feeling, or maybe it doesn't, it tells you the opposite, but you still know what it's telling the audience. So yeah, I mean, I suppose um there's that. It was daunting, it was exposing, but it's also a gift because I mean, if you love acting and you love the process of it and you love the preparation, which I do most of the time, um, it's it really made me have to think about things differently in ways that I hadn't done before, I suppose. And yes, I mean, body language was a key thing. a lot of it is unconscious stuff. You know, I mean, I don't think yeah, I mean, they're reflexive, and it's learned over a long period of time how to use your body in a certain way, a certain manner. But you know, I think subtlety is key. You know, I think there are a lot of performances where an actor is like celebrated for this physical feat,
Mm-hmm.
where it's very clear that they've made this sort of change to their body or their physicality. But I think subtlety is important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I fully agree. I love a subtle performance more than like a very loud one. And that kind of brings me to this question that I had about masculinity, like the role of masculinity in the movie, because it's very interesting between your character and his brother,
Mm.
and the sort of gentle way that that kid expresses his masculinity in contrast with this violent upbringing that he exists in. So, how did you relate to that character and that idea of masculinity, and how do you think that he sustains it in that sort of environment?
Mm, mm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm really glad you've asked me that because it's the first one today. And I remember thinking about it at the time. I remember speaking to a few the guy. We had a few like consultants who'd lived in this world in the 70s in the outback, um, either indigenous or white Australian,
Mm-hmm.
and had these incredible stories to tell us. But the way in which there's one guy in particular, I won't name him necessarily in case he doesn't want to be named, but who had really seen so much, and you could see that he had this kind of wizened expression on his face, and his face was really weathered and like had these grains in it in a way.
Mm-hmm.
He just it felt like he'd lived a number of lifetimes, and you think he's seen brutality, he's seen violence. He came off the street and was a street brawler and came into the boxing world. But the way in which he told me these stories was so um what's the word? There's like a serenity to it, a gentleness to it. And that really struck me. And then I thought about the expansive landscape of this world that they're existing in, and how even me being there and having shooting this film felt like I'd been there for much longer than I had. Like the history of that land speaks to you while you're treading over it. And I thought maybe that's interesting for kids,
Mm-hmm.
that maybe there's a not just a maturity, but a sense that there's a something ancient there. There's something like, well, in terms of his masculinity, that young, brash form of masculinity that is obvious and bold has no place here.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I felt like the weight of the world being on his shoulders, having done what he'd done, and his past constantly speaking to him in the form of like associations and resonances around boxing and what they still do for a living. Uh, there's no reason to try to prove anything, or you know, um, or even to compete, which is I think is really helpful for us in terms of what ends up happening
Mm-hmm.
to him. And when we do see the flash of anger in terms of what he feels he has to do to his brother to teach his brother a lesson, and that in the form in itself is a resolution between them. All of these things that have gone unspoken for a long time, and I think it has to happen in a look. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, it's the saddest thing I think he's ever had to do.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of his relationship with his brother.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope that this is
Well,
enough.
I love that movie. Like I love American westerns and like the idea of like the lonely person out in the middle of nowhere who's like dealing with all these things. But I love when it's approached with a different take on masculinity. I think it's so fascinating. That was one of my favorite parts of the movie.
Oh,
Um,
thank
yeah. So the kind of inciting incident of all of this of the film is a rematch between Kid and the heavyweight, the champion, but I'm not. It's an idea of redemption, but do you feel like Kid was agreeing to the fight because of redemption or because of something, a deep familial obligation, and kind of why he decided to do this?
you. Yeah, there's like these two. There is this parallel world that I think the film speaks to, which is what we would expect in a kind of tropey almost cliched way from a sports redemption movie, right?
Mhm.
And so it's almost like kids' reaction to this news, to this inciting incident, is in direct conversation with that.
Mhm.
That there is this world that would be the reason that I would go to do this, but it's much more prosaic. And I think in some ways it'd be easy to criticize the film for this, but it's this entrenched world, sorry, this entrenched thing that they exist in, which is to do with survival.
Mhm.
And yeah, there is an element of familial obligation and guilt there towards his brother as to why he's continuing this and living in this world of regret and guilt and grief,
Mhm.
really. That there is also no escape from that. I don't know. There's a kind of recklessness as well to kids' decision making earlier on in the story, and a carelessness. In a sense, it doesn't matter what happens to me,
Mhm.
um, because I feel he he feels he's nothing.
Mhm.
There's very little of him left.
Mhm. Yeah.
I mean, we have the kind of the MacGuffin of the tin and the money and is there a world in this? I remember talking about his dreams.
Mhm.
The idea of having an aspiration in that world seems perverse,
Mhm.
but there is a kind of still some youthful exuberance or optimism in him that hasn't quite died yet,
Yeah.
and that ends up becoming embodied in this romance, really, I suppose.
Well, that was since you mentioned survival, I'll make my last question. I would agree that he's very much survival until he meets Sunny, who is the romantic interest. So, do you believe that that was a shift in his definition of what survival is, and do you think that he starts dreaming of something more for himself?
Hmm. Um, yeah, I mean, as I said, like the idea of aspiration seeming perverse. I also think that the idea of longevity
Hmm.
is is kind of on an equal footing with that. But then when you're faced with amidst all this, what I would describe as horror
Hmm.
and brutality, when you're faced with something uh, of beauty, and when I say beauty, I don't mean in objectifying, Sunny, the character, but I mean her relationship with her son and their survival. When he's faced with that, there's a kind of a mirror image there.
Right.
Um, that is a moment of realization for him, and actually his relationship with this kid. And I think we do this. We kind of lay parts of our earlier psyche on a young person. We go,
Hmm.
was I like that? Um, and yeah, the idea that his role in life could change, that he could be relied upon,
Yeah.
um, is a natural progression. And in a way, in that sense, it's sort of also a coming of age film as well. It happens to be latent, but it's there. That perhaps I could be a provider, that part of myself that is natural
Hmm.
um, does have a place here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Billy. I really enjoyed the film.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. Good
Thank you.
talking to you.
You too. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you, Tina.